Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jill Tucker with CNA Foundation, and I'm delighted to facilitate this panel, which I've heard is going to be the best session in the entire forum. So please put down your phones, and we've told them to turn off the Wi-Fi so that you can listen to our illustrious panel. We really do have an illustrious and very diverse panel here that are going to address an issue that's really very important for the Bangladesh RMG industry, and that is the issue of purchasing practices. And the truth of the matter is, if we don't get purchasing practices right, we're not going to get anything right in this industry. Just so that we're all on the same wavelength, we have a definition of purchasing practices that you can see. We are defining purchasing practices as the way that global retailers and brands interact and do business with the manufacturers that supply their products. And this term can mean many aspects of the relationship between buyers and manufacturers, such as price negotiations, forecasting, lead times, order volumes, changes to orders, payment terms, etc. Now, I think we've already heard this morning about how the purchasing practices problem manifests itself. And there are many ways. Sometimes it is merely the risk and the pressure that the buyer is feeling is sent down the chain and passed down to suppliers. So the time pressure, the cost pressure is just a downward spiral that ultimately impacts the manufacturers and the workers negatively. And then sometimes there truly are unethical buyers that change the price or delivery or other terms, sometimes even after the product is already finished and sitting at the dock ready to ship. And I think you heard Mr. Momin of the Pride Group this morning talk about a buyer pressuring him, threatening is the word he used, who said, "You take this price or else." And I'm sure that is not something that is unfamiliar to the manufacturers in this room. But we're not here to talk about problems. So this panel is going to talk about solutions. We all know the problems. Let's focus on the solutions. Each person is going to have only 3 minutes to pitch their solution. And I will be a ruthless timekeeper. And then, well, I really want you all to listen carefully because we are going to have a poll after everyone is finished to select which solution we think is going to bring the most positive change to the Bangladesh ready-made garment industry. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Miran Ali for his solution.
Thank you, Jill. What I want to propose, and this I think is on behalf of most manufacturers, is that we want to see common standards applied across the supply chain, across countries, across buyers. There is no validity in the statement that it's a country-specific issue. Whether the roof is going to fall on your head or not is not a country-specific issue. It's a standard. It's a global standard. Not having the same inspection procedures in place in all your supplying countries simply means avoiding responsibility in the absence of a tragic accident. So all buyers must exercise the same fire, electrical, structural, and social standards across all their supply chain, even if it's not going to be to the spinner or to the fabric mill. Maybe that's a bit further down the road. But garments producers, the final product producers, whether it's garments, shoes, soft goods, small luggage, whatever is the item, the final product must be inspected from factories which follow a common standard. This will be the first thing to have a level playing field and reduce the constant pressure to reduce prices for competition between factories and between countries as well. The other point is the persistent, specifically in the case of a lot of European companies, the persistent prevalence of the use of middlemen as cutoffs value-added service providers, call it what you will. I'll call them a cutoff. The buyer will call them a value-added service provider. This use of middlemen, intermediaries, ends up taking away whatever margin the factory could have possibly had, ending up in the pocket of somebody else who's providing very little ways of service, where the ultimate buyer can actually do these things themselves by having direct relationships with the responsible suppliers. The whole concept is responsible buyers, responsible suppliers across countries, not trying to separate things by bringing up, well, we have Accord for Bangladesh and we'll experiment something for Vietnam, but we don't know what's going to happen. And in India, we'll do nothing, just for an example. So that's my statement in short. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The timing was perfect. And so you're talking, just to repeat, Miran is talking about consistent standards across countries, across suppliers, and also eliminate the middleman so that more of the profit can go to the people who are actually doing the work. Yeah. And next we have Fiona.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Right. I'm going for legislative solutions. I don't believe that voluntary solutions in this space work. And I believe that if we did have a legislative solution, then voluntary initiatives would be more successful. And let me explain why. Purchasing practices by retailers and brands, as you're all aware, can enable positive improvements. But they can also disable positive improvements and lead to corner cutting and reducing worker rights. The problems in purchasing practices have been documented for more than 15 years. I've been working on this for a number of years, and over that time period, I have seen that the practices in some areas have got worse. No amount of inducements to beg retailers and brands will actually improve practices, because the external context of constant price pressure, constantly faster, is continuing. So if the external environment is not changing, I do not believe it is possible to beg brands and retailers to change their purchasing practices. Any changes that are achieved will only be based on something that is temporary, and essentially will be changed if the retailer has a profit warning or the senior management team has a new change or whim. It will not be sustainable. The reason why I'm suggesting a change in legislative practices is that we now have at the European level a directive on unfair trading practices that applies to all food retailers, some of which obviously are also buying garments. If they breach this directive for how they buy food, they can be subject to investigations, fines, other types of penalties, and it has also been considered that confidential complaints can be made because suppliers are afraid of complaining. So I have come to share this suggestion that we should push for legislative change at a European level. But if we are going to have success in achieving this, I need your help. The level of evidence required for achieving legislative change at a European level will be fairly considerable, and it will take some time. So I have come here to find out if you would like a legislative solution. And obviously I will talk to other countries that are also supplying garments, because everyone is experiencing the same purchasing practices, problems. And if you would like a legislative solution, please would you join me in forming a coalition so that we start to push for change. And obviously I'm happy to take any questions.
Exactly 3 minutes. That was wonderful. So Fiona is suggesting a legislative solution where it is not voluntary to change and improve your purchasing practices, but it's mandatory, and where there are checks and balances, because there's a whistleblower or a complaints mechanism where people can, or manufacturers can complain about unfair trading practices. Thank you. And next we have Jeff.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. My 3 minutes are running, and of course my iPad is just dying, but we'll get that through. What I have as a solution for the issue is that at the buyer side, there needs to be an integration of all the social responsibility, corporate social responsibility, responsibility, business conduct, whatever you call it, policies and practices into the buying and sourcing practices and policies. From where I am working at the Dutch Agreement on Sustainable Garments and Textiles, we have high-level negotiations within the companies that have joined it, and with the CEO, the Chief Purchasing Officer and the Chief Sustainability Officer, we look at how systems work within the organization, whether the IT infrastructure actually supports sustainable purchasing, whether the position of the head of sustainability is sufficient to overrule a suggestion of a buyer to source from a manufacturer where the conditions are either unknown or known to be insufficient. And it's not to punish manufacturers, but it's to get clear that from the same company buying, buyer or retailer, brand or retailer, a coherent set of demands is communicated to the manufacturer. And in the ideal world, that is done one-on-one. But if we are not there yet, we might look into ways to team up in that respect. And buying brands and retailers can improve a lot. For instance, by publicly communicating that they would like to adhere to the ACT, the ACT, standards and claims on what you then do. They could introduce two-way codes of conduct, like the ones developed by the Ethical Trade Initiative, ETI, that not only demand manufacturers to meet certain criteria, but also tell the manufacturer to which standard the buyer is willing to be held in terms of not changing orders late, on payment terms, and all the things that have been mentioned before in the definition. So I think that is one element to look at, is coherence of the policy of buyers, and really make sure that within the company, in this case in Europe, that becomes coherent and the buyers are trained on the negative impacts they can cause or contribute to, so that they better understand what their decisions lead up to. I'll keep it at that.
Thanks, Jeff. So Jeff's solution is integration of the roles of compliance or sustainability and sourcing staff, coherence between their standards, and even I thought I heard you say sustainability or CSR can actually overpower sourcing, which I think we pretty much never see nowadays.
The good thing is that within the AGT, we are now seeing that some companies are actually changing their internal structure to get that done.
Okay. And now I'm really happy to introduce Frank from ACT, because if you've been here this morning, many people have been talking about ACT. So not to put you on the spot, but you have to live up to all of those references.
Yeah, thank you, Jill, and good afternoon to everybody. I think we all are clear that for too long we have a situation where we are playing in a game without rules, and bad practices have the tendency to push out good practices. If we want to change that, I think we need pre-competitive collaboration between suppliers and buyers in addressing the issue. And I think that's where ACT is about. I represent an organization where 21 large global brands and Industrial came together with the objective to address purchasing practices and enable purchasing practices that allow for paying better wages and improving working conditions. The brands we are representing are buying for $8 billion in this country every year. And if we see the ambitious goal here to raise the market to 50 billion, I think we all agree you will only manage that at production, and you only will get a fair price if this is done in a sustainable manner. And for that, what we think is brands have to change the behavior. If we want to move from a game without rules to new rules of the game, I think we have to start showing how we want to change our purchasing practices. That's how we started. We did a self-assessment of the purchasing practices. We discussed the suppliers in different countries, what are their key issues, and we came up with 5 key areas where purchasing practices have to change. It's incorporating wage costs as a separate item in pricing and make sure that the wages go up and everything else stays the same, prices go up. Secondly, having improved terms of payment, that you don't change the terms of payments, that you live up to what you promised. Third, to improve forecasting and planning. Fourth, I think very important, to make sure that the buyers in a factory are trained and asked to incorporate the sustainability requirements in their buying practices. And fifth, to have a responsible strategy if you have to exit a factory, if you have to go somewhere else. Now, these are commitments. How do we make the commitments credible? We just adopted, you can find it on the website, an accountability and monitoring framework. A key element of that is what, let me call it a bit provocative, that we need to have an element of reverse auditing. So we need a possibility for the suppliers to say, how can we check on what you are doing? So we will do an annual survey of the suppliers, and we come here to the country, we will have an intensive discussion with suppliers here, with BGMEA, to say, look, what do you need in feeling that our approach is credible? Because we will only make that happen if we work together on that process. Final point, I think I like the idea of Miran to say it should be at the same time, all over the world, immediately. He knows, I know, that's not what happens. We will have processes in different countries, but what is key is that those countries who want to be spearheading the sustainability approach, and our approach will be those where brands say, that's where we stay in sourcing. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. So ACT is going to be taking 5 steps. I'm not going to go through them all, but they're also going to be collaborating with BGA and BGMEA and other industry associations to make sure that what the brands say that they do is really what they are doing. And we'll talk more about that later. Shwapna, can you tell us what your solution is?
Very good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. While I agree about the standardization, globalization, and the legislation as well, I've got 2 simple solutions. We still didn't get our basics right. The first thing is, we have to be great marketeer. We have got these great green factories, we have got the great mills coming in Bangladesh, but when it comes to doing value-added products, we do not consider Bangladesh. Okay, it's always Turkey and China. So let's get the basic first. Let's promote first what we have achieved so far and be a great marketeer of bringing those value-added products where factory can make more profit. It's a mixed basket and the workers get paid better. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the collaborative efficiency increase. I think we are often challenged that the manufacturers are not efficient enough. But I think the brands got to play a big role here as well. I think brands play a big role to manufacturers in efficiency too. And this collaborative approach, having the capacity management, giving the proper forecasts, will help them making better planning and becoming more efficient. So I think this is very important. This collaborative approach of increasing the efficiency will improve the overall standard. The third thing I quickly wanted to say is the transparency. Now, how you are sourcing. We sometimes go to good restaurants and we love the food there. But we often try to check the hygiene inside. But I think the time is there. If the factories are actually testing really good, but I think the hygiene check is really important. So that transparency in terms of sourcing and buying would bring a big change to this practice of better purchase.
Thank you, Shwapna. So Shwapna said, marketing Bangladesh better, marketing the industry better. And I just want to underscore, since some of you might not have been at an earlier session where Andrew mentioned that made in Japan used to be, in the old days, it used to be a sign of shoddy workmanship. But that the government of Japan really worked to improve the image and to improve the quality until now Japan is considered, you know, the products out of Japan are considered to be the highest quality. So that is something that's possible here. And the other ideas you had were collaborative efficiency increases and transparency. And then our last presenter is Koen.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rare Foundation.
Hello.
The blue one, I think. This one will. It has been mentioned before.
Can you step here? Maybe it's the circuit.
Okay, it has been mentioned a couple of times that there is a power imbalance between brands and factories. And if you look at the value distribution.
Stop. They're not hearing. Try again. Yeah, try it now.
No, it's me, apparently.
It's ringing out, so I'll do it for you.
Okay, I'm going to try again. Now I think it has been mentioned a couple of times before, there's a power imbalance between brands and factories. Also, if you look at the value distribution along a supply chain, you see that most of the money and most of the power actually lies with the brands and retailers. And at the same time, responsibility when it comes to human rights compliance, improving the working conditions, lies almost exclusively with the factories. Whereas the brands accept very little accountability when it comes to their own responsibility in terms of improving working conditions. And that is something that we want to address, because we as Fairer Foundation, I think we are unique in the sense that we actually hold all of our 130 member brands accountable for their purchasing practices. So all the decisions that they make, when it comes to production planning or setting prices or following up on corrective action plan, all of the decisions that they can make are being held up for scrutiny, for verification by Fairer Foundation, and we report on this in a transparent way. I think this is also unique. You know, the assessments of the purchasing practices of our member brands are made public. It's on our website. And we are now planning also to improve our brand performance check system even further by start making use of data from better buying. This is something that we are also in collaboration with ETI. This is one of the things that we want to move ahead on, is that we are using data assessments by Better Buy on certain brands, on purchasing practices of brands, also in our own assessments of the brands, so that we can indeed report with even more informed information on purchasing practices of brands. And then secondly, I spoke about the power imbalance between brands and factories. We also see this when it comes to price negotiation. Prices are determined mostly by the price that the brand is willing to pay for the goods. They are not, or at least not sufficiently determined by the actual cost that is incurred by the factory to make the goods. So this is leading to a situation where a lot of factories are forced to accept orders which are actually below their cost of production. So in our view, when the labor costs go up, for instance because there is a minimum wage increase or when there is an effort to go for living wages, we need to ring fence the labor cost. We need to isolate and protect the labor cost in a transparent costing and pricing process. And this is what we are trying to do also through some of the work that we're doing on labor minute costing. We've developed tools which would help factories to negotiate with their customers and to make clear to them that they need a certain price in order to at least comply with the minimum wage legislation or going forward towards a living wage. And at the same time, this also helps brands, because also brands want to make certain that they pay prices that actually suffice for a factory to be compliant with statutory requirements. So I think this is a win-win situation, and so increased transparency on purchasing practices, but also increased transparency when it comes to ring-fencing labor and price cost negotiation is what we are all about. So, thank you, Jill.
Great, thank you. So Koen's talking about all of their 130 brands in Fair Wear Foundation. If you look on their website, you can find an individual report on the purchasing practices for each of those brands. So that is unique among any multi-stakeholder initiative that I'm aware of. And also detailed work on labor costing and ring-fencing the labor costing and being transparent about that as well. Now, what I want to ask you all to do now is to get onto the polling site. Is everybody, you've been using your phones all day. I'm sure you can get onto the polling site, Slido. And I want you to vote for which of these solutions you think is the best to resolve the purchasing practices problem in the Bangladesh garment industry. We're not going to talk about it quite yet. Just keep voting. I want to ask the panel something first, though. I think we all agree that we don't have time to waste. As Fiona said, we've been talking about purchasing practices for 15 years, more intensively the last few years. But we do know the characteristics of good purchasing practices. And so I want you all to tell me, in your scheme or your suggestion, is there any public disclosure, such as Koen described? Is it mandatory or is it voluntary? Is it cross-industry or is it a small group? And is there any sorts of a complaints mechanism? So if you don't have those four characteristics, complaint mechanism, industry-wide, mandatory, and publicly disclosed, how are we really going to solve this problem? And Frank, I'm going to start with you. And then we'll look at the poll.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, our approach is that if you look at wage setting, we think that has to be a national wage floor. It can be either done through minimum wage, or we would prefer to do it through industry-wide collective bargaining, because we think that also ensures that the industry itself, the employers and the workers, determine what is the wage level. Second point, it has to be an industry-wide standard about purchasing practices of brands to support this. We think that with having already a substantial share in the market, we hope that other brands are joining, that we can make this the industry standard, but we also think that nothing succeeds like success. So we need more members, but I think we do not need everybody on board, but we need a critical mass. And as I said, we have 8 billion in the country here to start the process. Concerning transparency, as I said, we have an accountability and monitoring report, process. There will be an annual report. There will be an annual survey of the suppliers, whether things which are promised to change do change. There will be a complaints mechanism, and I think unique to our approach is also that with Industrial, we have a trade union and all the brands have signed a memorandum of understanding with Industrial that they will live up to their commitments and that their membership within ACT will end if Industrial feels you promised and you didn't deliver. Did I get all your points?
Yes, I just want to ask you one follow-up question. Is 20 brands a critical mass? And if it isn't, what do you think is?
Well, I think we need more members. I don't think that I can say definitely to you what is the critical mass. It also depends on the engagement in a country, whether a country and the partners in the country say we want to go ahead. I think we have been having growing membership. We had a large retail company with 100 million turnover joining yesterday. So I think that we are growing. I won't put you a figure, but I think we have by far enough leverage to start the process.
And because we're being transparent, what was the brand that just joined?
Lidl.
Oh, great. Okay, so Lidl has joined. Shwapna, you were talking about transparency. So I'm wondering, does Marks & Spencer disclose information on its purchasing practices?
It's mainly with where we are buying from, the manufacturers. It's been transparent. And then all the components that coming with that products, it's been available for the common forum to have a look. And we are looking at standardization across the industry and the manufacturers as well for the future.
Maybe we can turn to Jeff. So the Dutch Covenant has about 70 brands that represent almost 100 labels. Do you think that that is enough to start moving with a critical mass changing purchasing practices?
If you look at the number of the companies, you might think it's a little bit small, but they actually represent about 50% of the Dutch market. And I think, if I understand literature on transition correctly, you need about 25% to 30% of any market that goes in a certain direction of change to be able to be successful. It's not guaranteed you will be successful, but if you're less than that, you won't be. That's from the literature on transition that I've studied. So if that's the case, 50% should allow us to go forward. And in that respect, it's, I think, relevant to note here that the Dutch agreement is kind of similar to the German Partnership for Sustainable Textile, which has a similar base. And they also represent around 50% of the German market. So teaming up with them helps us in many ways, and that's actually what we also try to do.
Staying in the Netherlands, I wanted to ask you, Koen, so how many of the Fair Wear brands are also in the Dutch Covenant, and how do you see that there's a need for both of your organizations just specifically on the issue of purchasing practices?
Just to clarify, we're not a Dutch initiative, even though we're based in the Netherlands. We're European initiatives, so the 130 brands are coming from, I think, 9 European countries. I think we don't see ourselves as an organization that has to be massive in terms of brands as our member companies. And we feel that we are, to some extent, we are small enough to be innovative. So we can really try out new things. And we see ourselves as an organization that seeks collaboration with other organizations in order to achieve the impact that we want to have. So we are collaborating with Chef from the AGT, we're collaborating with the Textile Bootnis also, we're collaborating with ETI, with ACT, and also in the different production countries we're working with the BGMEA, for instance, and the BGMEA in Bangladesh. So the change that we want to see happen, I think, can only come about if we pull together and try to build on each other's.
Perhaps we.
Yet your strength is that you're the only MSI that does disclose information on purchasing practices. Are you persuading others of all of these partners of yours to go along? Because there's not going to be industry-wide change with only 130 members.
Yes, that is definitely what we're doing. And that's why we're also partnering, for instance, with an organization like ETI, because we also want to sort of convey our knowledge and experience and some of the capacity building things that we do to other MSIs so that they can also have a stronger focus on purchasing practices vis-a-vis their member companies. And similarly, also, indeed, for instance, with the Textile Bootnis and AGT, we're also speaking about purchasing practices in order to convey and to increase our leverage that way.
Before we speak with Miran and Fiona, I just want to look at the, can you show us the poll? Hello? Because it looks like the legislative solution is the most popular. So I wanted to ask you, Fiona, how long do you think, I mean, you have experience with a legislative solution that addresses unfair trading practices. How long do you think it will take, or could it take, to achieve that in the global apparel industry? Okay, so we see.
Thank you for your question. I also wanted to go through some of your answers. So in terms of mandatory, yes, it would be mandatory. And generally, the legislation that has been passed so far is on the largest businesses. So it's mandatory on the largest. Yes, it is complaint initiated. Obviously, it's industry-wide. In terms of reporting, it might be worth you being aware that when Tesco's was investigated by the Grocery Code Adjudicator in the UK, it found that Tesco's collected supplier payments of 1.7 billion over 5 years, up to 2.4 billion. This accounted for 30% of Tesco's cash profits. So the idea that a brand or a retailer would drop that quantity of profit making somehow is ludicrous to me. Therefore, this is necessary to pursue a legislative approach because some of these trading practices are already illegal and abusive. The question is, how do we design the appropriate legislation? And that needs help. To get this directive on unfair trading practices in food, it took 10 years. We could reduce that time with good quality evidence and proper coalitions, and also if the retailers and brands did not fight it. On the food level, the European food retailers set up a little private membership organisation to purposefully delay and attempt to self-regulate it. Of course, it fails. Now it may work because actually it becomes attractive against the legislative approach that they actually will improve their practices. But that initiative delayed legislation by at least 3 years. So it is a long road, but I don't believe that voluntary practices alone can achieve it. I think the detail of what my colleagues are doing is fantastic, but it will be more successful against a legislative backdrop.
Miran, as the lone manufacturer on this stage, you've heard these solutions. Give us your unvarnished opinion.
Two comments. Number one, We are opposed to the idea of a legislative solution because I don't think it's practical. A, B, unless it's going to be a UN convention, it's not going to be useful because if you just look at this panel right here, we've got the AGT, Fair Wear Foundation, and ACT. These two gentlemen represent primarily Northwest European brands, and ACT represents one North American and a couple of Australian, and the rest of them are all Europeans again. We don't want another Eurocentric solution for a problem which is pervasive across the industry, across brands, across countries, across suppliers. We need a simple solution which is not setting up another foundation, another coalition or whatever. No, just demand people use the same standards across their supply basis. That's it. It's a simple solution.
But how is that enforced? I mean, how can you possibly enforce it seems like you are counting on the goodwill.
Transparency. Transparency. The more transparent you are, the more transparent your supply chain is, the less you can hide what's going on. Rather than giving aggregated results of your suppliers, of your brand's suppliers, you give specific.
Jeff's been waiting.
Yes, I would like to underline that in line with what you said, the AGT is based on the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which themselves were derived from the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So if you look for either a law, an international law, at UN level or something the like, there is already a framework there, and we deliberately in the Netherlands choose to take that scheme as the reference point because it makes clear that it is the duty of governments, of states, to protect human rights and labor rights and the environment, but that it is a responsibility of business to respect human rights and labor rights and the environment and animal welfare. So there is already a mechanism there which you could refer to if you want to have a common standard. And so my invitation to all existing schemes and initiatives would be to find wording on how they relate themselves to this international framework of the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines, and amend their processes if necessary to be able to communicate to their market, whether manufacturers, brands, retailers, NGOs, etc., how they can contribute to the solution that governments can better protect and that companies can better respect. And there must be access to remedies in all cases, but that's in our system as well. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Let me just answer your question. I am proposing legislation at a European level. The way that legislation at a European level works is the need for essentially fair markets, and it is the fair European market. So any business selling clothes in Europe, irrespective of the nationality of the business, would have to abide by that law. So to get fairness, you have to get fairness at a market, because consumers move for £3 or £4. So we are looking at a directive that would enforce fairness across Europe, is my proposal. And obviously I would welcome your support.
Yes, I would like to hear from you, Miran, because you were the one who was saying you wanted fair standards across the board, and it seems like that's what legislation is.
The moment you start trying to define what is fairness, that's more of a, I won't say vacuous. It's more, it's difficult to define. It's difficult to pin down. It's much easier to pin down standards like what's the width of your aisle, or what's your minimum wage, or what's your working hours, the ILO conventions. These are easier, more objective criteria. I want to work on objective criteria. I think Fiona has a rebuttal.
I do have an answer. So this is what has been passed for food. Payments later than 30 days for perishable products. Later than 30 days is illegal for a perishable product. Later than 60 days for any food is illegal. I believe you are all experiencing payments that are later than 60 days. That's the first two. Number 3, short notice cancellations for perishable food. Now, in your sector, it would be anything that relates to a unique event. So it's Halloween, it's Valentine's, whatever is a unique event, effectively as a perishable product when we come to the garment sector. Any unilateral changes to contract, any business that chooses not to give written terms is illegal under this. I could carry on. Payments that are not related to a specific transaction, so where someone's come begging to you and said, I'm sorry, I didn't meet my margin, any chance you could give me a donation, whatever they call it. It has no payment for a benefit. It's illegal. So it's very commercial. We're not talking about conditions placed on the factory here. No, it's purely on commercial terms. And then we've got a list of grey practices. But these ideas have to be adapted to what you have in the garment sector. And what I understand, going back several years to when we produced a guide on responsible purchasing in garments, sampling is a key issue. And I don't know, sampling is different in food, so we would have to think about how that aspect got incorporated into legislation, as well as what are the appropriate numbers that go into here.
I'm not sure if you can hear everything she's saying. It's very hard to hear, but I think what Fiona is saying is that what is unfair is actually defined in the directive, in the law, and they have a list of black practices that are illegal and then gray practices that maybe get some sort of censure. And so they are trying to get specific about what is fair and what is not fair. Does that help you?
I think we are both, we are all approaching the same issue, but it appears that we are approaching it from different sides. You're going for from the purchase side, the purchaser side, and what I'm propounding again and again is that we set the same supplier-based standards to be higher, so that the supplier base, if the supply base is high enough, everything else will follow accordingly. But I will take you up on your offer, because yesterday we started getting calls because Mothercare has started going into receivership, and they've started withholding payment on goods which are on the way. On board right now in the high seas. So we have a problem. It is not, the problem is undeniable. The factories, the hundreds and thousands of people who have been supplying Mothercare with all their products are suddenly going to be left in limbo while they go into receivership, because they have this wonderful protection system. Now, we have a problem. We need to find a solution which does not take us into a 10-year process of analysis and foundations. I'm not opposed to foundations, but analysis and foundations and so on, but something simple, quick, set common purchase standards across countries on compliance. Immediately eliminate a lot of the problem.
Is this something that the Bangladesh government could do, set purchasing standards?
We have effectively done so by requiring all factories in Bangladesh to progressively achieve a minimum level of standards in terms of its compliance in both labor law terms and as well as safety standards. By doing so, Bangladesh itself will be pushing itself to a level where you will not have those suppliers working in the export industry below a certain level. It's going to take us some time to get there, 100%, but we are, with the help of the former Alliance and Accord, have gotten there to a great extent.
Well, I think that would advance the discussion.
Your hand on the microphone. Yeah.
Sorry. I think that would advance the discussion considerably if we could say, okay, these are, for example, from your perspective, the standards you want to apply in the industry that by your standards think are the ways to achieve sustainability, that is achieving fair wages for your workers, achieving a sustainable development strategy for the industry, and put this forward and say, okay, this is what we want to engage with the suppliers, and if I talk about us, this is what we want to talk about, act about. You are a big group of buyers, or we are a big group of buyers. Are you willing to lead without this process? Are you willing to accept these standards? Do you have other ideas? And how do we also discuss this for other countries? I think that would be an enormous way forward, that we are not pushing back and forward. You demand something, we can't do it, and we fight each other or something like that. But we get an idea. This is what we think is a package of things, and we want to roll out this to different countries. And I think the solution, because you will not get it everywhere at the same time, is to say then sourcing has to stay and to grow in those countries who go ahead. I think that has to be part of the package. Because otherwise you can say, okay, we won't move until the last ship is moving, and then we don't make progress. So we need a way to say, if that's the way we want to go, if we can agree, then what is it, what allows us to go forward if others are not following at that stage? I think we have to crack that nut. If we don't do this, I think we go in circles, because we always can say we can't move because someone else is not moving.
So you're saying BGMEA would set these standards, or the government would set these standards?
No, what I'm saying is, as I started, I think we have to have a joint discussion about what we want to do. I think what would be a great start in this conversation, we have suggested some changes in purchasing practices, what we think can make a change. If also the BGMEA or the GMEC in Cambodia or others say, look, this is what we think are the standards we want, and then we have to have a discussion whether we can get to a kind of common commitment of both sides. That is what we make the standard, in the way how then we apply the purchasing practices and say that goes together with the national standards which has been discussed. I think we need that joint process.
If GMAC and BGME sat down, we'd just go for the lowest factor possible. So we need to have, there has to be some imposition of higher standards. Because otherwise you're going to have the lowest standard in every country is going to be the minimum standard of all countries. But I would again come back to this and say, having a primarily, and this we will be, Frank and I will be having extended discussions on the same subject, having a primarily European membership and trying to start a project in only one country rather than at least competitive similar countries with a slightly wider range of members, you're starting with two arms tied behind your back. It's going to be difficult. We agree with the idea of responsible purchase practices. We just want to see that we don't, lose our competitiveness while trying to implement standards which are not yet respected by 99.9% of the purchases, and probably 100% of the member companies as well, because they haven't got the systems in place yet. And at the same time, we don't want to continue this race to the bottom. So you have to find a common ground.
Well, the good thing I can tell you is that from the AGT, based on the OECD guidelines, they apply to all countries, all manufacturing countries. So Bangladesh is a very important manufacturing base for the Dutch garment and textile sector. It's second after China and before India and Turkey, which is kind of a traditional breakdown. So we certainly also address these issues when companies that join the AGT tell us they source in Myanmar, Vietnam, and Cambodia. There's no difference in treatment there.
Can you give me a minute? I think no one wants to set for the lowest standard. I think the key point is you can't just impose a standard on someone and saying this is what you have to do if people don't want to do it. So you have to have a conversation. I understand that, for example, in Bangladesh, you say we don't get a fair price because we are not recognized for the efforts we have been doing. We have certain standards and we want to improve standards. And my suggestion was, let's discuss about this. What is a sustainability concept for that industry? How can this look like? What would that require from purchasing practice? How can we get others on board? How can we broaden the base? But I think the starting point has to be a common understanding. We want to lift standards, and we need a change in purchasing practices. We need a change in supplier practices, and we need basically a mechanism which gives everybody a say that what is promised is delivered. And my thinking is that we had too many initiatives where people were thinking it all up at a desk and then coming to a country and say, this is what we do. So that was my suggestion, to say, look, we want to hear from you. If you say you want sustainability standards, what are you delivering? You know what we think, that wages in the country has to go up, that this is an expectation consumers, governments has, that the pressure will come. That has to change purchasing practices. We have to work on that. And I think I agree with you. We cannot just focus on one country. That's why we are discussing in different countries. Also, that needs further to develop. We need more brands. But on the other hand, I think if we have a good concept, that's the way you get more people on board.
No, I think indeed it's clear that we cannot only focus on one country. And indeed, legislation at the European level could play a role. It would help to create also a level playing field, which I think is important. Yeah, if we speak to some of our member brands, they indicate, we are doing a lot, we are investing, we are looking at our purchasing practices, we are committed to improve working conditions. Hey, but our competitor is not doing the same. So they're at a competitive disadvantage, actually, because they are investing their effort and money into improving working conditions. So legislation could help to create a level playing field. But at the same time, I think it's also important that legislation can be enforceable. So I think there are lots of challenges when it comes to enforcing legislation, which is talking about a violation, which is perhaps happening in a country which is outside the European Union. It is related to a supplier that may be very unwilling to report it because he may be jeopardizing its business relationship with its customer. So I think there are lots of challenges when it comes to actually enforcing legislation at the European side, and then we end up with a risk that we end up with legislation that becomes more sort of a reporting requirement or sort of a greenwashing thing, and I think that is really the risk when it comes to legislative development.
Thank you. The food sector's had obviously a similar problem. So what we are talking about is a cross-border abuse. The decision-making happens at a European level. It is the European strategy of the business to ask their buyers to put their suppliers under undue pressure. Those decisions are made in Europe. It is possible to enforce it on Europe. The complaints, obviously, will come from suppliers around the world, and there is a choice. You can either initiate a complaint that is confidential, or it is up to the BGMEA to act, to aggregate complaints if necessary, to shield your members, but to cooperate with the regulator. And that is how it works in practice.
I think, Bangladesh is very strategically positioned. And I think as an industry, we are setting the example for the rest of the world to follow. What is very important in this topic is connecting all the dots, be it legislation, act, BGMEA. I think there is a great commitment from the brands that they would love to play the part to bring the standardization, because for everybody sourcing out of this country, it's an important place to source from. So everybody will be part of it. Connecting the dots and with all the best practices will be a key change. And that, I think, BGMEA can be a great platform to bring all those dots and take it forward for the future.
I understand there's a question from the floor. Yes, you need a mic. Do they have a mic?
Hi, hello. My name is Ayub, and I'm one of the manufacturers in Bangladesh. I was very carefully listening to all that you have said so far, and to be honest, I'm a little confused. See, if I go back, I'm an old man now. If I go back to the old days, the business was booming, and we had no issues, not as much issues as we see today. Primarily, I feel a fair purchasing was practiced better than now. It is all because we had the shared responsibility amongst the purchaser and the manufacturer. And we all believed and we all had the mutual trust amongst ourselves. I think somewhere down the line that is lacking now, which is causing all these problems. So we need to really look into those. And having legislative controls, having impartial or third-party bodies to sort of arbitrate problems may be a solution. But why should we have to go to that when we can have a common understanding how to have a fair purchase in the first place? So I think let's put the fundamentals right first and not treat the manufacturers irresponsibly and not treat them unfairly. Then I think the mistrusts or the misconceptions are going to be lesser in the future. Thank you.
So wait, I'm not sure if I heard that. You said the real breakdown is in trust?
I think it's big on the trust and in the way the purchasers or the brands today behave. Let me give you an example. We had a recent wage increase, all of you know that, last year. And the net effect, according to my calculation, was about 18% on our cost. We had a brand, and a very fairly, good brand, and a very well-known brand. They agreed to increase the cost, our CM cost, by 8%. And then after a few months, they said, no, the company is not doing all that great, so we agreed to a 4%. We said, okay, fair enough. And as we were moving ahead, they said, sorry, we can't do that. And today, we are in a situation where they are dictating us that we need to really relook at the prices being reduced by 20%, you take it or leave it. So that's the kind of a situation, the challenges that we are facing. And whether you call that unfair practice, whether that is a fair purchasing, I have no definitions of that.
I think that is the problem that we're trying to resolve here. I mean, personally, I wouldn't want to, it sounds bad, depend on trust. I just want an honest business relationship. I don't want to trust my computer company. I just want a computer that works. So, I think that honest business relationship is what we want, but we're trying to figure out how you get that, how you let's have Fiona give one more comment and then we'll end it.
Sir, thank you very much for your point. My feeling is that good quality business relationships are where two people negotiate in a tough manner. Both parties have to be able to say, I don't like it, and walk away. That's the crucial bit. And walk away if you don't like the negotiation. The challenge is that people aren't able to walk away. So that's question number one. If you have a good quality relationship where everything has to be agreed by both parties, that works well, and that would not trigger the enforcer to act. The problem is that we are having unilateral changes imposed, sometimes in an untraceable manner, on suppliers. And by untraceable, it can be a phone call. Email is traceable. But if those things are recorded, and it is recorded as a unilateral action requiring a supplier to change, that does not count as fair business practices. And to some extent, that is where the trust has been undermined. And I also would like to get to better quality, trusting relationships. That's how business should be conducted. But for some reason, the power of brands and retailers is such that they are able to bully their way around the place. And therefore, I think there is a need for legislation.
As we end this panel, I just want to harken back to what Shwapna said and what Andrew said earlier. Bangladesh is a country of firsts and has a lot to be proud of. You have more LEED certified factories than any other country on earth. You had the Accord and the Alliance, which led the way on what transparency in fire and building safety can look like for the industry across the globe. And you have Mapped in Bangladesh, which is the first effort by any country to map every single export-oriented garment factory in the nation. So let's be bold. be the first to effectively tackle an issue that has an enormous effect on not only this industry, but every other country's apparel industry. And hopefully Bangladesh can be the first and can set an example for the rest of the world. And I think, Mostafis, do you want to say something?
Yeah. Hi. I want to say something. Like we quite often talking about the transparency, and we demand the transparency from the both party. We expecting transparency from the buyers. We also expecting transparency from the manufacturer. But when we do complain, why we say a buyer? What is means a buyer? I don't know a buyer. I want to know when I complain, I want to know the buyer name of the customer. So quite often I hear a buyer had not paid. So when we generalized a buyer, that means it goes to everybody. If we don't have the brave, we should not talk. If we talk, we should talk with the fact, figures, numbers, and the names and transparency. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think Mostafis always has the final word. Thank you very much.
We moeten voor de foto.